Good afternoon. I'm Chris Teutsch, Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center, located in Princeton, Kentucky. And I'm going to be talking about kind of taking all the concepts that we've talked about today and kind of putting them together into a system that's going to extend grazing. As most of you know, the largest portion of a cow-calf budget, and it makes up around 40 to 60% of the total cow-calf production cost, is going to be winter feed. So doing things that will allow animals to harvest forage more days of the year for themselves and reducing the amount of conserved forage that we need in the grazing system is going to positively impact the bottom line of cow-calf operations. So what I want to do is kind of talk about putting the pieces together into a system that allows you to extend grazing and reduce the amount of conserved forage in a grazing system. Lots of different species adapted to Kentucky. Now, in your location, these may be a little bit different, but there'll be lots of different options that you have for your particular location that you can use to fit into a system to extend the grazing season. We're not going to talk about all these today, but I do want to talk about some of them and spend a little time talking about how they might fit into an extended grazing system. So generally speaking, we can group our grasses into either cool or warm season grasses. We talked a little bit about that this morning during our forage growth and management session. Cool season grasses, of course, are going to have optimal growth at cooler temperatures. They're going to have their best growth around a leaf temperature of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. They tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein and have a longer total growing season. In contrast, our warm season grasses evolved from our cool season grasses to get around this problem of poor growth during the summer months. So photosynthesis in our cool season grasses is not efficient during the summer months. In warm season grasses developed some mechanisms to get around this problem of low production. They have optimal growth at higher leaf temperatures, somewhere around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They tend to be a little bit less digestible and lower in crude protein. They're more efficient at using nitrogen than cool season grasses. And their fiber structured a little bit different inside the plant leaf, which makes them a little bit less digestible. They tend to be more drought tolerant and definitely more efficient at using water during the summer months. They'll produce somewhere around twice as much dry matter per unit of water used compared with a cool season grass. That's important to remember. If we have the ability to put some water on during the summer months in the form of irrigation, then we're much better off to utilize a warm season grass because they're more efficient at converting that water into dry matter. Even in rain-fed systems, if water's limited during the summer months, we're going to get more efficient use of that rainwater by having a warm season grass in the system. This is just a nice temporal picture of a cool and warm season grass. So this is taken in March in our tall fescue, which is on the left-hand side of this photograph, is up and growing. Our bermuda grass, which is on the right-hand side, is not dead. It's just dormant. It hasn't gotten warm enough for it to start to grow because it's a warm season grass. Up there in the left-hand corner is a little patch of alfalfa, and you can see that that's up and growing also, which is a cool season perennial legume. This is a typical growth curve for a tall fescue white clover pasture in western Kentucky. And again, we have what we call a bimodal forage distribution. So we have a hump of growth in the spring, hump of growth in the fall. Not much going on in the summertime. We call this our summer slump. You can see how if we would add a summer grass or a warm season grass to this system, that would provide a lot of growth during the summer months and kind of fill that summer slump in production. And that's kind of what we're after. We want to provide a steady source of forage across the entire grazing season. And we're going to talk about how to accomplish that by using several species within a grazing system. I wanted to talk a little bit about tall fescue, and Matt Poore will talk about this in more detail later, about how to manage tall fescue in grazing systems in the southeastern United States. But tall fescue is by far our best adapted cool season grass. Love it or hate it, it's what we have to work with, and we really need to be thinking about it as a blessing rather than a curse in our grazing systems. And to really get the most out of this grass, we need to think about how we manage it in systems. We want to have good soil fertility. We want to make sure that we include legumes in mixtures with tall fescue and potentially other grasses, cool season grasses. We want to incorporate novel endophyte tall fescue, and Matt will go into much greater detail this afternoon talking about managing fescue in grazing systems. And then our strongest attribute in tall fescue is stockpiling for winter grazing. And stockpiling for winter grazing is simply accumulating forage in late summer and then deferring grazing on that forage until we get into the winter months, usually into the December, January, and February. This photograph was taken on February 10th in the south side of Virginia. It just snowed. This particular tall fescue was around 16% crude protein and 60% TDN, so high enough in quality to meet the nutrient requirements of a lactating brood cow. Also, much higher in forage quality than most of the hay that we make in the south side of Virginia, which would be running somewhere around 55% TDN and a crude protein of 10% or so. So stockpile tall fescue really fits well into fall capping systems because it's a very high quality forage as we move into the winter months and can replace hay within that system. It costs about half to a third as much to feed a cow per day with stockpile tall fescue versus a conserved forage like grass hay. Orchard grass is one of my favorite cool season grasses. It's well adapted to the transition zone states. Not as well as tall fescue, but pretty well adapted. One thing it doesn't tolerate well is close and frequent defoliation. Probably one of the worst things that's ever happened to orchard grass stands was the invention of the disc mower. It just cannot handle close defoliation, especially as we're moving from the spring to the summer months. Like other cool season grasses, it has limited summer growth. It's a short-lived perennial. It has some disease and insect issues. Horse people really like it for dry hay, and it makes a beautiful dry hay. It's nice and soft, especially the second cutting of dry hay. Are there more persistent varieties? And there are some improved varieties out there that do have a little bit better persistence, but at the end of the day, they're still orchard grass. And orchard grass is just not quite as well adapted to the southeastern United States as tall fescue. I do want to mention tall fescue, and often referred to as the queen of the forages. I sometimes call it a pouty princess, and the reason why I call it a pouty princess is that it has a very specific set of parameters that it needs to be productive, and we'll talk about those in a minute. It's a long-lived perennial deep taproot system which allows it to find water when grass root systems cannot. Aggressive nitrogen fixer, probably our most aggressive perennial legume in terms of nitrogen fixation, 150 to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. But it has a very specific requirements in terms of where we can grow it at. It needs well-drained soils. The soils need to be high in soil fertility. They have to have a pH of 6.5 to 7. We need to rotationally graze it if we're grazing, and it can cause bloat if we're grazing pure stands of alfalfa. Probably the easiest way to mitigate the chance of bloat is to include grasses in that stand. So it's a mixed stand of alfalfa and grasses. So great forage, but has a very specific requirements in terms of soils, and most of our pasture soils are not going to meet these requirements. Red clover is probably one of our most important pasture legumes in the transition area of the United States. It's a short-lived perennial. If we use just a common variety-stated red clover we have no idea the origin of that particular variety or seed source, it's going to last 1 to 2 years. If we use an improved variety, we'll get 2 to 3 years of persistence out of that. We've got a lot of data showing that. We also have improved yields with improved varieties. So we'll yield somewhere around 30% more with an improved variety compared to a common variety of red clover. Good drought tolerance, excellent seedling vigor, which makes it easily established via frost seeding. And frost seeding is simply broadcasting that seed in midwinter onto a closely grazed tall fescue sod, and then allowing freezing and thawing events to incorporate that seed by causing that soil to heave and small cracks to form in that soil. It incorporates that legume seed into the soil. And because red clover has good shade tolerance and excellent seedling vigor, it makes it very well adapted to frost seeding. Make sure you use certified seed. We have an older variety of red clover in Kentucky, which is still a very good variety. It's called Kenland. It was selected at the University of Kentucky. A very old variety, and it's a public variety, so you can buy it at the co-op. But if you buy Kenland seed, make sure it has a blue tag that's certified. That guarantees that it's really Kenland in that bag. If I buy a bag of Kenland and it's not certified, could be anything in that bag. So make sure that you use certified seed. Just mention white clover real quick, and Mary talked a little bit about that this morning. It's an important legume in pastures, and it is important because it kind of fills in between bunch-type grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue. So it stands thin, and we get an open area between those clumps of grass. It's nice to have something there that we want instead of a weed. And because white clover has stolons, which allows it to creep into those areas, it's very good at filling in those areas between plants and a thinning sod. We have 3 basic types: a small or Dutch white clover, a medium or grazing type, or a large or ladino type of red clover. Generally, we recommend overseeding pastures with a large or a ladino type of red clover because it produces 3 to 5 times as much dry matter compared to a Dutch white clover. And we talked a little bit about the stolons. It doesn't have great drought tolerance, but it's very persistent because it produces a lot of seed, which can last decades in the soil. Very high in forage quality because when we graze, we're not grazing the stem. Remember, the stolon is a modified stem growing along the soil surface, and wherever there's a node, it can put a root system down. So when the animal grazes white clover, it's getting just the leaf and then the petiole, which are both highly digestible in the rumen of the animal. I want to mention annual lespedeza. This is a warm season annual legume that's non-bloating, was used a lot, 60 or 70 years ago before we had ready access to lime and fertilizer for changing soil fertility. Much more tolerant to low fertility and low pH than our more traditional legumes like red and white clover and alfalfa. 2 types, there's a Kobe, which has more prostrate growth and doesn't reseed quite as well, and then a Korean, which tends to respond a little bit better to soil fertility. It tends to have higher yields, a little bit better drought tolerance, does have some susceptibility to diseases, but is a little bit more dependable reseeder. We did some work when I was in Virginia, and Korean almost always out-yielded the Kobe in most cases. There's really no commercially available varieties of annual lespedeza right now. There are several that have been available in the past, and those would be Marion, which was a university selection, and then another variety called Legend. But Legend has its seed fields contaminated with some Kobe, so it's really a mixture of Legend and Kobe lespedeza. So my best recommendation, if you want to try annual lespedeza, you can frost seed the lawn in winter, the winter months, and I would just use a variety not stated Korean annual lespedeza. Just want to mention Sericea. Is this a weed or a a forage. And I guess it depends a little bit on the state that you're in. Some states have labeled Sericea lespedeza as a noxious weed. Some states have not. We see a lot of Sericea lespedeza on reclaimed areas, so it could be road cuts or potentially reclaimed mine land. It's a long-lived perennial warm season non-bloating legume. It's really the only perennial warm season legume that we have that's adapted to the northern transition zone. Extremely drought tolerant of acidic soils and poor fertility, although it does respond to improved fertility. So if we want to improve yield of Sericea lespedeza, we could add some fertilizer and lime to the system if needed and called for by the soil test. There's several cultivars that have been selected over the years, but really only one cultivar that's commercially available now, and that would be AU Grazer, that was selected at Auburn University as a can you come back later? So there's several varieties available. There's several varieties that have been developed over the years. Most of those are not commercially available now. There's really only one commercially available variety, and that would be AU Grazer. It was selected at Auburn University for moderate levels of tannins, finer stems, and grazing tolerance. So if you're going to try Sericea lespedeza, this may be a good one to try. It needs to be grazed rotationally and has kind of poor seedling vigor, so we would recommend establishing Sericea lespedeza by itself and then interseeding grass back into it. Last thing I want to mention about Sericea lespedeza is because it does have tannins in it, it has some natural anti-worming properties that could be valuable for small ruminant operations. Just want to mention bermuda grass, and we talked a little bit about this morning, but as our winters become more mild and we're seeing changes in our USDA plant hardiness zones, which measures the average minimum winter temperature, we're seeing those creep northward. And as they creep northward and our winters become more mild, we're starting to see more warm season grasses come into our pastures. And so we're actually managing not pure stands of tall fescue anymore, but mixtures of tall fescue and warm season grasses like Dallas grass and Bermuda grass and warm season annuals like foxtail and crabgrass and other warm season annual grasses. Bermuda grass is one of those grasses that are kind of creeping northward. It is well adapted to Kentucky, especially the southern and western portions of the state. Relatively little has been planted because we don't have really good access to sprig sources and the right equipment to establish it. So improved hybrids of Bermuda grass don't produce viable seed, so we have to establish them from pieces and parts of the plant, and those would be the root system and the rhizome system of the plant. And we've never really had the right equipment in northern transition zone states to make that happen. There has been the development of seeded Bermuda grass varieties with increased cold tolerance, and you would establish these like any small seeded forage, and they're making the use of Bermuda grass a more practical option in northern transition zone states. These seeded types are marketed as two ways, either one pure variety in a bag or a blend. And when we have a blend, we want to avoid blends that have Arizona Common or Giant because we know those are not going to survive the winter in the northern transition zone. We want to make sure that the varieties in the blend, and they'll be listed on the seed tag, have been tested in the state and have decent cold tolerance. Even ones with decent cold tolerance can winter kill if we get an extreme winter in northern transition zone states. I just put this slide in here, and this is a study we did with seeded Bermuda grass and nitrogen fertilization. On the bottom axis, we go from 0 to 600 pounds of nitrogen, and we want to bracket that response. Of course, don't ever put 600 pounds of nitrogen on your Bermuda grass. And then on the y-axis, we have yield. And basically, what the point that I wanted to drive home is that Bermuda grass is one of those forage species that if we really want to optimize production, we need to put a little bit of nitrogen on there. And we need to put that nitrogen on this smaller split applications. So we would never put 300 pounds of nitrogen at one time, but we may put it on as 3 or 4 applications during the growing season. That total as 3 or 4 applications during the growing season. Okay, I want to mention crabgrass. Weed or forage? It depends a little bit where it's at, right? So if it's in my wife's flowers, it's definitely a weed. But if it's in my pasture, it could be a pretty decent forage. Well adapted to the whole Mid-South region in southeastern United States. It acts like a perennial. It's a self-reseeder, but it's actually a true annual, so it's got to come back from seed every year, but it's a very prolific reseeder. We need to double crop it with a winter annual like annual ryegrass or small grain. Good yield potential, but where it really excels is forage quality. It has better forage quality in annual performance than Bermuda grass. Can accumulate nitrates, but no prussic acid generation potential. This is Red River crabgrass in a trial that we had in Virginia. This was 60 days after seeding. We're harvesting the trial in this photograph. What I want you to understand is that when we used improved crabgrass varieties, they've been selected for higher dry matter production and more upright growth. This happens to be Red River crabgrass from R.L. Dalrymple. And these are the varieties that are currently available. There's about a half a dozen different varieties available, mostly from R.L. Dalrymple. Red River has gone off of variety protection, so there's a lot of different people growing it, and it's not as pure as it used to be. So RL developed another variety called Dow's Big River from Red River, and that's under variety protection. We know that that's a good variety that's available. Mojo from Barenbrug Seed is a blend of crabgrass. It has several different varieties in it. The nice thing about Mojo is that it has a clay coating on it, and it makes it easier to broadcast and run through seeders. Some varieties of crabgrass have some hairs on the seed, which causes bridging in the seeder. So if that occurs, then you need to mix that seed with a little bit of carrier to get it to flow through the seeder. Okay, this is just a diagram to remind you that annuals, like crabgrass, and this is crabgrass response to nitrogen fertilization, are going to respond to some nitrogen fertilization. We had 305 pounds was our maximum yield production with crabgrass. And don't ever put 305 pounds on your crabgrass. We want to be down here in the straight part of the curve, so somewhere around 100 to 150 pounds. Apply to split applications to stimulate crabgrass growth during the summer months. But the point of this graph, of course, is that in order to maximize yield of annuals, so things like sorghum, sudan grass, pearl millet, crabgrass, we do need to put a little bit of nitrogen fertilization on it, and Mary had talked about that this morning. So in vitro digestibility can be quite high. Crude protein is reasonable, 10 to 14% in season. As it starts to senesce in later season, it can drop down to 6%. And that's also related in warm season grasses more closely to nitrogen fertilization. This is a summary of average daily gain that was done by R.L. Dalrymple. He did a whole bunch of stalker work at the Noble Foundation, and in the 1990s he summarized that work. And on medium quality crabgrass, he would expect unsupplemented gains of around 1.75 pounds a day. So crabgrass can be a very good summer forage. In a head-to-head competition in Oklahoma with Bermuda grass, crabgrass yielded resulted in average daily gains of 1.75 pounds versus 1 pound on Bermuda grass. I do want to talk just a little bit about a species that we commonly have in pastures and hay systems that we think about as a weed because it's been outlined as a weed by our row crop brethren for a long time, and that's johnsongrass. So this is a sorghum species, and it's a perennial sorghum species. So it comes back from rootstock each year. Spreads by seeds and rhizomes, commonly found on old dairies and bottomland, thrives under hay management. So it likes to be defoliated, breasted, and then defoliated again. So it needs rotational grazing management to be persistent in the grazing system. Where we don't find it is in continuously grazed pastures. It's fairly palatable, and animals will graze it repeatedly during the grazing season and eventually graze it out of the pasture. Response to nitrogen fertilization, good quality if it's managed. Like most forages, if we manage them and harvest them at the correct growth stage, it's going to be pretty decent forage quality. Does have prussic acid and can accumulate nitrates under drought stress and high nitrogen fertilization. This is just an interesting piece of data. This was from the an article from the Noble Foundation, and it listed the nutritive value of different warm season grasses. And lo and behold, on the top of the list was johnsongrass in terms of nutritive value. Just want to mention our more traditional summer annual species, and they can fit into grazing systems also and provide some summer forage, and they include things like our sorghum Sudan grass and pearl millets. So Sudan grass tends to have finer stems, better for hay. It tends to be a little bit lower yielding and may have some more disease issues. Sorghum Sudan grass is a cross between Sudan grass and forage sorghum, has coarser stems, tends to be higher yielding but a little bit more difficult to cure for hay. Better option would be baleage with any of these summer annuals because they do tend to have larger stems that can be difficult to get dried out for dry hay. Sorghum species like well-drained soils that are fertile and a pH above 6. Nitrates and prussic acid can be an issue in these in these species. So our past recommendation for using a variety is find a reasonably priced, locally available variety and focus on management. And again, management is really important with any of these summer annuals to optimize it because we have a cost incurred in planting these each year. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing both grazing management and fertility management so that we have in optimum yield. One thing I do want to mention about pearl millet and sorghum Sudan grass is that we can select varieties that have a brown midrib trait. And this is a mutation that results in a brown midrib, which is a phenotypic expression of something that's different inside that plant. And what's different is that it has lower levels of lignin. Lignin cross-links fiber in the plant and makes it less digestible in the rumen of the animal. And it results in lower animal performance. Varieties that have the brown midrib trait generally have higher digestibility in the rumen and increased animal performance. So if you're selecting a variety for a grazing system, it would be good if you could select a variety that has that midrib trait. And this is just a graph showing the consistent response of the brown midrib trait in terms of increased digestibility in the rumen fluid from the animal. Just want to mention my favorite winter annual, and that will be annual ryegrass, hands down. One of the advantages of annual ryegrass is that not only does it have high yield and excellent quality, but it regrows after we graze it. If we graze a growing point off in a small grain like triticale or oats or wheat, we don't get substantial regrowth in that. Regrowth in annual ryegrass is limited by high temperatures we move into the summer months, so it will keep regrowing after we graze it in the spring. So it's probably by far my favorite winter annual grass species. adapted to a wide range of soils that has pretty consistent production over the years. Does require a little bit of nitrogen fertilization to optimize forage growth. Cold tolerance as we move into the northern transition zone is important. We want to make sure that we have varieties that we know are going to overwinter. Sometimes we'll have some winter injury in some varieties. Can be a serious weed in small grain, so just be a good neighbor and don't plant it right beside your neighbor's wheat for grain harvest. This is just some production data, but what I want you to look at is the bottom line here, and the bottom line is the average yield over years, and it's going to be somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5 tons of dry matter produced per acre per year. So a pretty substantial yield for a annual species. So I just want to kind of put everything together into a grazing system and kind of sew things up here. And our goal should be grazing about 300 days a year, and that means we'll be feeding hay for about 2 months. And that's kind of what our economists tell us is the ideal hay feeding period would be about 60 days. A potential system for what we call a transition zone of the United States would look something like this. We'd have a tall fescue base. The first thing we can do to extend grazing would be to defer grazing on some of our acreage in the fall and allow that acreage to stockpile, and then utilize that stockpile grass for winter grazing to reduce the amount of hay we're feeding. We can come back, we can fill that summer slump in with something like crabgrass or a perennial warm season grass. And then we come back with a winter annual to kind of fill those gaps in, mostly in early spring. It'll give us about 30 days earlier grazing if we have a well-managed cool season annual grass in that system. So I don't live in a dream world. It takes management to do this, right? So it's important to remember that there are no free lunches. It's going to require some management. But we have a whole bunch of different tools in terms of forage species in our toolbox, and if we can get those tools out and kind of put them into a system that works for us on our farm, we can really reduce the amount of conserved forage that we need in our grazing system, and that's going to impact the overall profitability of our grazing system. All right, is there any questions? Thanks for your attention. If you're interested in learning more about forages, just scan this QR code and it'll take you to our UK Forages webpage, and you'll find a ton of different information there, including a link to our KY Forages YouTube channel.